Morris County overall. So the issue of um, issues around tenants, financial impact of paying rent, the rights of renters, not just from a financial perspective, but also around COVID-related discrimination, has a particular impact on residents of Mount Olive. Um, and so it is with that in mind that we as Mount Olive Democrats and Mount Arlington Democrats, we are advocates for a healthy, prosperous, and informed community. And it's really in that spirit that we're proud to present tonight's talk on tenants' rights featuring attorney Cara Parmigiani. Before I get into a more detailed um, introduction of Cara, I just want to mention that we did receive a small number of questions that were submitted in advance, so we will get to them during the presentation. If you've been on a Zoom meeting before, you'll know that you have a chat box. You can see that on your bottom toolbar. If you go to the chat, please feel free to put in any questions or comments during the presentation. During Cara's talk, we will have everybody on mute, but please feel free to either raise your hand or type a question in the chat box. Please note that we will be recording this, so if for any reason you don't want your video to be on the recording, feel free to take the camera off. We'll plan on going to about maybe 8 o'clock or so, maybe a little after that, depending on the conversation. So it's purely up to you and up to Cara. I've been asked, just from a disclaimer standpoint, that on this call, Cara will not be providing any specific legal advice on a personal level, but since this is an open forum, this will be more of a general advice session, and any questions that we don't have an answer for can certainly be followed up on. So with that being said, please let me introduce Cara Parmigiani. Cara is a Morris Plains resident and an attorney with a general practice in Mountain Lakes. You may recognize Cara from her recent campaigns. Cara was a county freeholder candidate in 2019, as well as a Morris Plains candidate for town council this past year. So many people are very, very familiar with her very strong campaigns over the last 2 years. Cara is an attorney who represents both landlords and tenants. She has experience mediating cases in the Morris Sussex court system, and herself is a third-generation landlord. Her experience gives her unique insight into cases that help her to advocate for her clients. Of special note, Cara, in addition to being an attorney, is the Sussex County Young Lawyers Division program organizer and also is the Sergeant at Arms for the Morris Plains Democratic Committee. Her education includes a bachelor's degree from Rutgers and a graduation from the Seton Hall School of Law. Of special note in her volunteer work, she is with the Unchained at Last nonprofit group, which is the only group in the US dedicated to helping women leave or avoid arranged or forced marriages and rebuild their lives. Also, on a personal note, Cara is also a martial artist who continues to teach, which I expect Cara may come into play in your Sergeant at Arms role. She's an artist who exhibits across the state, a filmmaker, and a gym enthusiast. Cara also has a dog, Presto Parmigiani, who I see is not with you this evening. So it is with that great pleasure and great gratitude, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a real honor to be here. I'm thrilled to come and talk about landlord issues. It's one of my favorite issues to discuss because there's so much that goes on. And there's so many questions that folks have over the years of representing people and representing my own family in landlord-tenant actions. I've seen all kinds of stuff, even mediating cases, and it's good to be able to address some questions that you haven't thought of and answer some questions that have been asked before. I know that a lot of folks are in really, really hard situations, and it's really challenging. and we're going to try and tackle some things, but please feel free to jump questions into the chat. Again, I can't answer specific questions, but I can answer like more general questions. So if you can make your question a little less about my place and just say, well, you know, and generally, if you have X, Y, and Z that happens to you, what, you know, and we can talk about that. Okay. I'm not trying to run away from your question. It's just ethical guidelines. Okay. So a lot of questions that, a lot of things that I've seen have a lot to do with moving out and final procedures. I'll work backwards. Okay. A lot of folks, when they're moving out of their apartment, one of the most important things, or house, and one of the most important things is getting your security deposit back, right? A lot of folks don't do enough to protect their security deposit return. And what do I mean by that? You have a digital camera that has untold number of pictures. Take pictures of everything, not just pictures of things that are broken, but things that are okay, walls that are okay, ceilings that are okay. If you have extra film space, record drains functioning, like water going down the drain in as many places as you can think of, and hang on to that. Because later, if a contractor comes through and they have to clean up or do something, sometimes things wind up in that drain that are not necessarily caused by you. And when you get that little charge for having to snake out a drain, it's nice to be able to show that that's there. Or if somebody had done additional damage after you left or whatever, it's important to have all those that photography, especially that you've moved everything out. I had one very interesting case where folks had actually followed my advice, taken pictures, whatever. Landlord eventually responds, and they had said, "Well, your large multi-gallon fish tank is still there." And I had pictures of the room without the fish tank, and also pictures of the fish tank in their current apartment. And so it was that kind of thing. And we showed, they were saying the drain didn't work. We had videos of the drain working. We had hundreds of photos to document that the place was actually in great condition. Another way to get your security deposit back is to leave a forwarding address. I got this from another landlord, is they've been trying to return a security, and there's just no address. And when there is no address, the landlord's only obligated to send a letter back to wherever your last known address was, which was that house or apartment or wherever that you vacated from. And that's not helpful either. So make sure that you do that, take the photos, save the photos, hang on to them and the videos, and make sure you do that thing. We have a lot of questions. I always get a lot of questions about dog deposits. They're kind of a new thing in vogue in some places. In New Jersey, you're only allowed to, in residentially, to collect 1.5 months of security. If that pet deposit exceeds the 1.5 months, it's my interpretation, and I've gotten into fights with other lawyers about this, but you're not allowed to exceed that security deposit. Now, if you have a pet fee per month, that's a different thing. And you have to check out whether or not there's any rent control in that area that would max out some of those fees. But in a typical situation where rent control doesn't apply, they can do a pet fee. But watch out for those pet deposits. That's going to get somebody into trouble. We also have a lot of questions with regards to your relationships with the landlord and inspections. A lot of people get really upset because they feel like their landlord has a lot of access to their house or apartment, that the landlord's coming in, or you don't know when they're coming in, and it's violating your personal privacy, and you feel very upset by it. Check out your lease and be careful, especially when you're just starting to enter into a lease. And since we're building backwards, we'll talk about entering into a lease, and then we'll talk about other questions people have. But take a good look at your lease. A lot of leases will allow a landlord to come in with 24 hours notice, or shorter, or whatever, or even to show a place. In emergency, a landlord is almost always allowed to just come in. An emergency would be water just leaking, an electrical issue, something of note that's going to cause substantial damage to the apartment. So keep that in mind as well when you're talking to your landlord and when you're starting your lease. Depending on the bargaining power that you have, if it's an apartment that's fresh off the blocks and it's gorgeous and it's brand new and there are 15 people interested in it, you're not going to have the same negotiating power as someone who had this spot, it's been empty for a while, it's the winter time, not a lot of interest. Then you have more latitude to talk about your lease, but it's always important to talk about your lease with your landlord, because there are some things in leases that you may, take, you want to take a serious look at. Like if you have serious privacy issues, you got to address that. If you have pets and you don't want your landlord to know, they'll find out at some point or whatever. And then you have to go through this whole rigmarole about, possibly getting evicted for cause, because you have a pet or damage your pet does. I think it's always better to be upfront with your landlord. And there are some good landlords and there are some bad landlords, just like everything else, right? There's some very unreasonable people who are very impossible to deal with. And there are a lot of folks who are ready to do the right thing, but you just got to be able to, meet them where they are, right? I always think of this, at least negotiations, like The Godfather, right? I want to make you an offer that you can't refuse. But if you don't know where the other side is coming from, it's impossible to make them any kind of offer, right? So you have to figure out where your landlord is coming from. What are they doing? Are they a benevolent old lady who doesn't need the money and she doesn't have a mortgage and she can kind of work with you? Or are they a young family who just got this investment property and they're trying to do the best they can? Remember that a lot of landlords too, they don't have a lot of liquid assets. So that's like cash on hand. Your rent is the cash on hand that they need. And so sometimes it's very challenging, and especially in these COVID times, and we'll talk about eviction in these COVID times, it's, uh, it's also challenging on landlords. Not saying that we have to like bend over backwards or whatever, but this is just the condition that they're in. And sometimes they're under a lot of a crunch to pay their mortgage or to pay whatever else they need to do, or the electricity or the heat, or depending on how that's distributed. And so they've got to do that too. And so that kind of creates a struggle. And usually a smart landlord wants the tenant to stay, wants good tenants to stay, and wants tenants that don't cooperate, tenants that make other tenants unhappy, tenants that are impossible to move on to greener pastures where they'd be happy and more comfortable. So that's some of the top things you have to deal with. Now, during COVID, we have some new rules with regards to evictions. There are no eviction proceedings happening at present, because Governor Murphy has an executive order that has stopped that. Now, it will not stop somebody from filing it. You can still file. They're just not going to be heard. And until that executive order is undone by another order or whatnot, and then 2 months after that, then evictions will start to proceed. But there's a backlog. There's a backlog of probably hundreds and if not thousands of cases ahead of you, depending on when your case was filed. So don't think that immediately your case is just going to percolate up and things are going to happen. It's just not going to work that way. So that's not a thing. And presently, you can take your security deposit and apply it directly to the last month of your rent. Now, everybody thinks that, well, not everybody, but most people think that they can automatically do that anyway. That's not true. The security deposit, and this is really important to understand, is not for the purpose of rent. It is for damage that's done to your apartment during the course of your tenancy. And that damage is not ordinary wear and tear. So it's not like, well, the carpet is 30 years old, whatever. It's that carpet would have to go no matter what or whatever at the end of your term. It's for extraordinary damage. You broke a window. The place was left so filthy that, beyond, it wasn't broom clean. They had to pay for a cleaning service. And your landlord will have to itemize all of these expenses, debits from your security deposit, and would have to send you a letter within 30 days of your vacating the premises, whether it be a apartment or a house or whatnot, whatever you're renting. And then and you'd have an opportunity to take a look at that. And then if you disputed that amount, well, then you could contact the landlord or go from there in your own form of litigation. But right now, litigation is not a thing that happens because, again, evictions have been stalled out. There are two different kinds. I wouldn't say kinds, but ways that folks get evicted. It's for failure to pay rent, or it's for cause. Cause is more like violations of covenants of the lease, and and that's, or lease rules, right? Failure to pay rent is very straightforward. And if you go to court, you will probably have to watch a video about tenants' rights. And it'll say right in there that there's nothing the judge can do for failure to pay rent. You don't pay rent. That's it. It's usually like, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. There are ways around this. If you don't agree with your landlord about something, or you've paid some expense and you feel like the landlord should reimburse you, and so you're not going to pay your rent right now. Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, landlord will eventually file for eviction. One can only imagine. The thing is, though, if you want to dispute the payment of rent, you have to have that rent held in escrow. You have to be holding on to it. And then you have to deposit that with the court. And then, only then, can you have a hearing on the rent amount dispute. Okay? So if this is the case that you honestly feel like there's something going on, you don't agree with the rent, you've had to move out because it was too cold or something had happened or something, you've got to take that money and put it away, because and every month that you're going to be doing this, because at the time your case finally gets to court, you've got to have that money. And if you don't, well, then too bad. Okay. So that can be a challenge for a lot of folks. So just make sure that if that's what you're doing. Also, if you're arguing that the reason why you're not paying rent is because the place you're living is uninhabitable. Uninhabitable means that you cannot live there. If you are still living there and you're claiming that it's uninhabitable, you're arguing against yourself, right? If you're saying that it's impossible to live there, but yet you still live there, it's not helping your case. You would honestly, in a bulk of these cases, have to move out. You have to find someplace else to go. Okay. Evicting for cause means that your landlord is going to have to serve you with a variety of notices, and they're very specific notices, and they have to be with regards to very specific instances in your lease that you're not complying with, or local ordinances, or the law generally. And they have to give you an opportunity to cure those defects. And that's it's a very challenging process. And that's why the terms of a lease, especially for a landlord, are very important, and especially for a tenant to understand, because the second route, is so much more complicated, but you've just got to make sure that everybody's in alignment. Okay. And so I know there's been some talk about the People's Bill, which would provide some support for folks and who haven't been able to pay their rent. However, it hasn't yet gone through. So until it does, and I don't know what the final form is going to look like, but I mean, basically give renters 6 months to repay each month of unpaid rent, with all arrears paid within 30 months. So it'd give you a little bit of a break on the timing of how to kind of spread out unpaid amounts of your rent, but the rent is still due. So it's good. It gives people more time, but it would make each rental payment going forward just slightly more, right? To catch up on the back money and going forward for 30 months. But 30 months is a long time. So hopefully it'll allow people to, get themselves back on their feet and do what they want to do. But there's no substitute for talking to your landlord, if at all possible. There was a question that had been submitted earlier, and I think I can kind of hit this now, about late fees, right? Landlords can always charge late fees. It's in your lease. It's typically also part of additional rent. They can always charge it, but typically in negotiations with your landlord, and especially as cases kind of evolve, late fees can be one of the first things that gets thrown out if people honestly want you to stay. If you're really going to come up with the rest of the rent and it's going to be within some reasonable time, sometimes landlords are completely willing to throw out late fees just to kind of get everybody back on track and do it, right? Again, the more money a landlord has to spend to track you down, the less likely they are to be forgiving about this kind of thing. But typically late fees in negotiations, and that's just insider kind of tip get thrown out. So that can be a really good thing. Also to note, by the way, that in your lease, it'll typically say that additional fees include additional rent includes attorney's fees. In New Jersey, that's been reciprocally interpreted to also include tenants' attorney's fees. So let's say, for example, this landlord-tenant case goes to court, and let's say you don't settle. Most cases settle, by the way, because you're going to get mediation typically, and most cases settle in mediation. But let's say they don't, and one party is proved right by a judge. In that case, the prevailing party could get attorney's fees. And I say could as in it could happen. Sometimes judges would, I can't control what judges do, but typically you should be able to, the prevailing party, which is a real switch because in the American system, as opposed to the British system, the American system, everybody pays their own fees. This is one of those rare cases where you can fee shift. Also, it's important to note that if you qualify, you can receive free legal assistance as a tenant through legal services of Northern New Jersey or legal services of wherever you are. Sometimes they include free tenant assistance. And that's important to jump on earlier than later. And I know they're very good at what they do. Especially some of the folks I know there are great. I love going back and forth with them because it's a real activity. But at the end of the day, it's all about relationships and preserving what you have and hopefully working together where eviction may be a ways off to try and get everybody situated in a good way. Dealing with other questions we've had, we're going to tackle a challenging question about several questions about what is about rent increases, right? Okay. So what is a reasonable rent increase? There's no answer for that. What is a reasonable rent increase? The answer is, and most people hate this answer from attorneys, is it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on where you're at and what other places are similarly situated. So let's talk about an example. This isn't an example that was emailed to me, but it was, it's an example of a case that I had fairly recently. And so it's a true story. So here's the deal. Like I said earlier, a benevolent elderly lady owned a place. She didn't need the money for a variety of reasons. She was okay, no mortgage on it, whatever. Then passes, and her executors and other folks that are managing the place do need the money. And she had been renting it below market value, below anything else, and it was a real steal for these people. And that was fine. And they had a family. But when she passed, again, like the new landlords needed the money, and they had to raise the rent. And so they did. And it was substantial. It was quite a jump up. But they would be able to show, and this would be a showing. It's not like if you were to challenge this legally, you'd have to go through and show. And they showed that their new mortgage was X, Y, and Z, and this is the taxes on the property, and this is what it costs to have the heat and electricity and blah blah blah, and show that they were actually in negative numbers, or that they weren't really making a profit. And being a landlord is a profit-making activity, right? And so they could show, but at the same time, what is a reasonable increase, right? You can't just get to someplace by like leaps and bounds. I can't just increase your rent, something that shocks the conscience. And that's a court term of art, legal term of art, right? Shocks the conscience. And what shocks the conscience in one place or with one judge depends on their personal experiences and other things. I've had folks that have found that $20 per month was a lot or not a lot or whatever. It really does depend. And somebody was saying, well, you're in a complex. Well, what are the other rents of the complex? Are other people paying $2,000 a month and you're only paying, $185? Is that, is that right? So you have to kind of go around. And so it does make it challenging to figure out what is a shocking rent increase. Obviously, the point is we don't want folks raising the rent in such an extraordinary way with the underlying purpose of getting rid of you, right? They don't want to evict you for cause, like we stated earlier, which is a complicated procedure. Instead, we want to raise the rent something so astronomical that we hope that you'll leave, or if you pay, congratulations. That's what we're trying to avoid, right? It should be based on what the landlord's actual needs are and what's fair, right, to get there. And the procedure for doing this, and this is going back to another question in the chat or in my email, was that every year, let's say you have a lease that expires annually, right? Every year in advance of that, you're obligated to receive a notice to quit with a new lease, right? And it's your obligation to accept that lease or decline the lease. And if you decline the lease, you should leave, or you'd be a holdover tenant. And typically landlords are entitled to 200% of the rent for holding over. So that can be quite astronomical for folks who are on a limited budget. Without doing anything, your lease, by agreement, your lease could go on indefinitely. In New Jersey, your lease would continue as a month-to-month lease if not renewed. So let's say landlord doesn't send you a notice to anything. You just got keep going. I've had folks who've had leases from 2018 still in motion, 2016 or whatever, or you can put in a lease that every year it increases by 5% or whatever it is. And that lease will just continue to cycle, right? So it is really interesting. And then the lease cannot change between the term. So let's say your lease is supposed to be from April 2020 to, the end of March 2021. Between then, you shouldn't really be able to change the lease unless by mutual agreement between the parties. Fantastic. But after that, the landlord can come up with new terms that may include a variety of other things like smoking on the balcony or pets or other things. So you want to make sure that you keep your relationship open with people and let them know that, yes, I do have 3 dogs or whatever the case is, because when that lease renewal comes up and you look at it, make sure you're reading it so you understand what's in there. And if you have some issue, you should bring it up then rather than, again, people finding out later and go from there. But I hope that kind of answers that question. Let's see. Okay, breaking your lease. That's another really good question somebody had. It can be a challenge, breaking your lease, but not necessarily an impossibility. It happens. Sometimes relationships don't work out. And you shouldn't try and force a relationship that's just not working. Sometimes people have been there a bunch of years and some people haven't. The lease obligates you to be on the hook for the full 12 months or 2 years or whatever it is. But sometimes the landlord is happy to see you go or realizes that you're not happy there or satisfied there and it's better that you move on. And so it's, again, gets back to same answer for a lot of questions. Communication with your landlord is clinch. Sometimes they'll still make you pay a couple of months because it's going to be empty for a couple of months. Sometimes they'll just say, well, bon voyage. It really depends on the landlord. Part of the issue with breaching too is, again, you're responsible for the rest of the lease. So let's say, again, in my April to March example from earlier, right? And let's say you leave in August, there's a whole mess of months left. You would be responsible for those months, but the landlord also has a duty to mitigate And by that, we mean he or she can't just sleep on their rights. They can't just be like, well, and I'm just going to wait it out. And when April comes up again, then I'm going to really start looking, or I'm going to start really looking in March, and get that thing together. It's not how it works. The landlord has a duty to mitigate, which means that they have to get on there and try to relet the space. Now, very technically, if they relet the space for less money than you had been renting at, so let's say you rented at $2,000 and they found somebody for $1,100, technically you could be responsible for the difference, that they were unable to rent it for the same price and then there was a deficit. But I very rarely find that landlords pursue a lot of these claims anyway. And they're usually just glad to have somebody gone and somebody else in, but it's not impossible. And so let's talk about that for a second, right? What if everything goes south? And what if you do wind up owing your landlord a lot of money and one day you leave in the night and you just bail, right? Okay. Landlord-tenant court, as people refer to it, only answers one question. Only one question, and it's stay or leave. If stay, then you pay, right? Like I was telling you earlier, you haven't paid your whole rent, blah, blah, blah. And if you pay it, that's it. Eviction, it ends it right there. There's no more cause of action. You're done. Pay or stay, right? If, or, you fix whatever problem it is and you landlord work it out, right? But it's stay or leave. If you get evicted, right, there's a judgment for possession. That's what happens that day. And then from there, your landlord has to have a warrant of removal. And then a court officer will facilitate the move out, and only then can the landlord change your lock. Otherwise, it's a crime. It's a low-level felon, a misdemeanor. But it's you can't lock out your tenant before the warrant of removal or before you guys agree to be gone, right? Okay, but let's talk about where monetary damages come in. That would be in the special civil division, right? And then your landlord could sue you for back rent, damages, or whatever else they want to sue you for, okay? So that doesn't necessarily happen in the landlord-tenant court. It's actually two separate actions. And a lot of landlords get this confused too, because they're like, well, and he did damage to blah, 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 unless you're taking it out of the security. And even then, once the tenant has gone, left, whatever, then it's not in landlord-tenant court anymore. And that's very important for people to understand because they start getting confused about the rules, and there are different rules for different things. And let's see. I just want to say, and then there was a question about water meters. This question is, this is not a question I've ever actually gotten before, although I have dealt with water meter issues before. Typically, they're installed by the utility company, and really it's up to them. I don't think there's anything you can do to get, I don't know the answer to this one. So, but about individual water meters, sometimes I have had them installed and other things, but it's challenging because it depends on the pipe setup and other things that you've got going on there. And I've done property management, and just sometimes it's just not going to work out. You're just going to have to break it down as part of the common area fees or whatever you want to do, and just divide the number among everybody else and hope that there's no water leak or whatever that would drive this up. But usually too, a lot of water payments are basically a small flat rate anyway for median usage or average usage, right? So it's not that any one tenant in particular tends to drive up the water unless there is a water issue. And I've had that happen, but usually the landlord can work that out separately with the utility company to see what they can do about that. So that's that question. Quickly, I just like to say a little side note. Insurance, renter's insurance, get it. The landlord's insurance is only going to cover the structure, maybe some of the outside, and so that's it. So let's say a tree goes down, it damages the roof causes leaking, the leaking destroys your television, your bed, and other things. Or if you're an apartment up top above you leaks water, it's usually a water issue, water or something, whatever, or fire. the stuff inside your apartment is not covered by the landlord's insurance. That television, that bed, whatever, is goner. Okay, so make sure that you pay for the renter's insurance. It's actually not that expensive and typically can be bundled with your car insurance as well in a way that makes sense. Make sure you take a good look at that and make sure that you're not paying to replace the item as it was. Like, for example, if you have a television from 2018, you don't want the value of another television from 2018 because it has no value, right? You want to be able to replace it with another television, preferably 2021-ish, or like a new couch, right? You don't want to have to be bound by trying to find replacements for things that can't reasonably be found or that is so low in value. Like, what is the replacement cost of a 2-year-old television? What are you going to get? $20? I don't know. So make sure you read your lease, make sure you read your insurance policy, make sure you talk to an insurance carrier who knows what they're doing, and can help you to not necessarily pick out the least expensive policy, but the one that's going to cover you the best. Okay, so I don't know if anybody has any additional questions. I'm thrilled to answer anything that I can, and if I don't know, I'll be happy to try and look into something and maybe get you a different answer.
Well, Cara, that insurance was very timely. In our Village Green apartments, we had a fire. 6 families lost their homes. That was about 3 weeks ago. So that's very, very timely about the insurance.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens all the time. It happens all the time. People just do not realize, and sometimes it's only like $30, even for, and what an amazing amount of coverage you can get. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cara, I have a question about that. Not specific to me, but it is something that we find in another corporate landlord apartment complex in Mount Olive.
Mhm.
And I just wonder if you've heard about this. In addition to renters are required to have renters insurance. In addition, the corporate landlord has the structural insurance for the structure. But the corporate landlord in one complex in Mount Olive also requires that tenants purchase additional renters insurance through their insurer. So they pay for it twice. And there's no, it's almost like I'm just wondering if you ever heard of that. It's almost like, in fact, an insurer who provides my renter's insurance and my auto's insurance told me they felt that it was double dipping. But they require you, I mean, it's an automatic payment in every tenant's monthly bill, and you can't negotiate it out of the lease.
Wow, that's really interesting. Again, I can't answer specific questions about things, but that's the first time I'm hearing about that. A lot of landlords do obligate tenants to have insurance in their lease. Very rarely do I actually have tenants that do that step. Commercial tenants will, because they realize the value of their investment, right? But very rarely do residential tenants, I think, in my experience, realize how important it is. But if they are double dipping, then somebody needs to check it out and really fully investigate it, because why should you have to pay for 2 things? But insurance can get very nuanced in terms of what's covered and what's not covered in the policy. And these policies, as you know, they're multi pages long. And sometimes one policy will carve out just a little exception that might be valuable to someone else. And so it's really important. Like, I've seen some people who, even if you have a pet, now require special insurance coverage for the pet. If the pet dies in a fire because they've been sued because some fire had happened, or I would imagine pet has died, and now suddenly their champion Bichon is, unfortunately caught up in that and the damage done to that. So I've seen all kinds of insurance issues back and forth with landlords. So it doesn't necessarily surprise me, but I definitely check out, the nuances there and see what it is. And then, if enough people have an issue with it, they should, and, in bulk, make their complaint known, because I don't, I just don't see the point in double dipping, especially when the landlord doesn't necessarily make money off of the sale of insurance policies. They just want to make sure certain things are covered, and sometimes.
It's the only corporate held landlord complex in the township that does that. The others that are corporate held don't have this additional insurance policy request that's built into the monthly payment. So there's probably some nuance, like you just mentioned, that covers it, or the request of tenants to pay for it. But I wanted to ask if you had ever heard of it before, because that's one of the issues that always comes up here as a conversation of concern from tenants.
Wow.
I have two questions. Can you
Sure.
hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Two things. What's a reasonable water bill if you've got a one-bedroom apartment? Because I get charged like $48 a month, and I do think that's a little excessive for what it's one of those ones where you share it with everybody, and they, that's what everybody pays. That's one question. The second question is, recently the corporate landlord started charging $450 a month for service fees for me to go into their website and pay my rent, which I think is a little ridiculous too.
Okay. Well, again, I can't answer specific questions, but with regards to your water bill, I don't know. Look, even from, it depends on your water company, and what's going on with your water. I really don't know. I wish I had more information on that. I think you might have submitted the water bill question earlier that I alluded to, but I really don't know. It's important. Maybe you might want to call the water company and ask them what their flat rate is typically for a building this size, and see if their usage in this building is exceeding that amount and where that would fall into it. Some buildings have very old piping that tends to leach out some water here and there, or very inefficient. If the water is used for the boiler and other things, I mean, it may be very inefficient, and who knows. So I really don't have an answer with regards to that, and I apologize, but I couldn't specifically do that. With regards to the, I guess, $4 and whatever for the processing fee, I don't know what their online platform costs them. A lot of these billing mediums come with a cost. And for example, I've used another platform, and they do charge, or they'll charge for credit card processing or whatever else they charge. So, and that usually gets passed on to the tenant for direct deposit or for credit card payments or whatever. So that's not terribly unusual. Even if I buy when I was able to go to the movies, a movie ticket, they pay, $2 or whatever to process a movie ticket. That's only like $13, which I think is quite high anyway. But that's only $13, and your rent is probably multitudes larger than $13. So for $4.50, and plus what it would cost to mail in your rent. Let's say you mailed it, but you wanted to make sure that it got there, so you send things certified mail, which I'm a big proponent of, sending things certified mail if you want to have tracking and make sure that it got there. That's $475, $414 just to mail something. So it's about the cost of mailing something with tracking. So to put that in perspective, I don't think that that's too much to pay for a transaction fee. But that's just me.
Yeah, well, it's on top of, like I said, it's a corporation owned this and bought this out in 2007, and my rent now is up like to 70% of where it started out in 2007. So the rent goes up pretty high every year.
Well, and that's a challenging thing too. Your rent is always going to go up every single year. unless you again have the,
It went up like sometimes $50 per month and stuff like that. So it went up in an excessive way.
yeah, and that
For a
can be,
one bedroom apartment, you start out at $850, and it goes up to like $1,500 a month. That's a lot over 14 years. So I just think they're being a little greedy, personally.
well, and this is the thing too, is that rent has to keep up with inflation. And sometimes, especially in commercial landlord-tenant relationships, rent tends to go up with CPIW, which is the Urban Wage Earners Index, and other factors that help to at least keep rent above inflation. So every year, landlords' taxes go up. Every year, landlords' insurances go up. Every year, blah, blah, blah. And that's part of the reason why rent has to go up every year too. Otherwise, they're going to be in negative, kind of behind, you know.
Yeah, but I really think this particular company owns like 150 complexes in 17 states. So I think that, you know, they're making sure that they make money, personally.
Sure, sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
I have another question from a shy person. Okay, let me see. What did she say? Okay, so if you were leaving an apartment because it was unlivable, do you still have to put that rent in escrow? And at the same time, you're paying rent for your new apartment. So is that something you would have to do? You still
Right.
have to put it in escrow.
So that does create a very intense financial hardship on people. But remember, for a hardship, not for a hardship, for the habitability claim, you are going to need to argue that claim, and the court just will not hear it unless you have the money behind you. So unfortunately, if you are going to go down the full road of it, it has to be in that court the day that you have court on that day. And if you do not, and it's not there by the time the court stipulates, usually it's by 4-ish, 4:30 in the afternoon. Too bad, so sad. So I don't make up these rules, and they're crummy in that, yes, you would have to be paying perhaps double rent, right? Because you're now living someplace else, but you're not paying them to live there. So that gets challenging. But remember too, if you've really fully left, they can't evict you, right? Because we already said that landlord-tenant court only answers the question of stay or leave. You've left. You're not habiting there. The landlord then really can't even, you shouldn't even be there. The landlord should be then switching gears to be suing you in special civil for the money left over on the rent, the unpaid rent, right? He cannot evict you from a place where you're not living. So hypothetically, you were actually getting back to the question, maybe you wouldn't have to put rent in escrow because you're never planning on coming back there. You are fully breaching, fully leaving for the reason. So it might be important to save some money back, because what if the landlord's right? What if they win? Right? Then you might have to pay them, or the landlord would have to go through the collection process and try and get it back. But if you have fully, and you're not planning on coming back, some folks are planning on coming back. They're like, well, if the heat went on, then I'd be able to move back in. So let's say heat goes off or whatever, and you move out for 2 months, heat comes back on, you move back in. Well, there's your rent issue, right? There's your escrow issue. That money should be there. But if you're like, this is uninhabitable, and you never come back, and you have no intention of coming back, then you can stop, potentially stop collecting your rent to hold an escrow, because then it's just a breach and goes different. And if your landlord does try to sue you in landlord-tenant court, then you really need to check that out, because you've left. And one of the things they have to fill out in their complaint for eviction is, are you still there? is the tenant still there? And if they fill out no, and yet they're still going down this road, that's not where it should be. If the court staff should, not allow their filing to go through. But every so often things go through the cracks or whatever. It's really important to have a forwarding address or something so that you know where you're being served, that you're being served or something. And your landlord should be making reasonable efforts to really find you as well. But there you
Thank you.
go.
So, Cara, are you familiar with some of the resources available in New Jersey? So, for example, we understand that the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs offers housing assistance programs.
Right.
Are you familiar with that program, and what type of assistance, would people be able to be eligible for with the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs?
So that's a really good question. And they do have a website, and you can always feel free to check that out. Typically, they require minimum income levels and things like that. Now, as soon as you're served with a complaint for eviction or and it's coming down the pipeline, you should reach out to them as soon as practical, because it takes them some time to get you the resources that you need. So like I said, the only way to stop an eviction is to pay money, typically, right? And the landlord does not have to accept an extension of time. Either the court cannot make the landlord wait. So if you're like, well, I'll have it to you next week, the court cannot force the landlord to accept it next week. It's that day or whatever. So if you're going to receive rental assistance from any source, you have to make sure that you contact them early and make sure that the day of or whatever, that you have something on the ground that you can get going. And a lot of folks don't reach out early enough, and then it becomes a struggle because the landlord doesn't have to give them more time to accept this. So that's the thing. Rental assistance can be great for folks because it may pay a percentage of your rent or in certain circumstances, the whole thing. If you have certain mental illness, there are resources for you in Morris County as well that you can check out. And they can provide assistance. And again, you have to qualify. I don't know what the specific qualifications are other than you have to meet obviously some income requirements. That's about it. It's really important to know your rights going into things. And certainly, again, if you qualify as well, you could get, at least in Morris County, Morris, Sussex, legal services who can get involved. And they're a really great team of people who are very knowledgeable, do this full time, all the time, protecting tenants' rights. And so they're a really great resource to have in your corner if you do need financial assistance. But this is a problem because the day of court, that's it. You can get hardship stays if you apply to the court. Let's say you're during eviction or whatever, and you have a very unusual circumstance that requires additional help. You have someone with maybe a severe illness, or it's during the school year and your child has very, very specific needs and they cannot be moved from that jurisdiction during that time, or something else that's like very, very, it creates a very intense hardship. But even so, there's a limit to the amount of time the court can allow them to stay. And even during that time, they still have to pay rent. So it can be challenging on folks who have special situations, but in no case in an eviction proceeding are you thrown out that day. That doesn't happen. I have people ask that question all the time. On the day of your court case, you will not be immediately removed from the premises of wherever you were renting, but you should make a plan to move out as soon as possible, because eventually a warrant for removal will happen. The court officer may be summoned to come out and remove you, and they will remove you. And if you don't have all of your stuff out, that's it. They're going to take you out of that place. I have been there on several occasions where folks have been shocked by this occurrence. And they knew it was coming. They knew it was coming at 9 o'clock or whatever it was, 10 in the morning. We went through the whole thing, and they, grabbed their toothbrush, but they still had everything else in the apartment and left. And then it becomes an issue of trying to get their things to them. And it's just a whole other level of complexity.
Good question.
Yes.
According to Governor Murphy's executive order, you are allowed to use your security deposit as rent. When is that appropriate in, like, let's say you're struggling in COVID, and let's say you've lost your job or you're furloughed or that type of situation. And, you don't have anything foreseeable for the next month or so. However, you do have your security deposit of a month and a half, and now you're being told, look, nobody can throw you out right now, and you are able to use that, the security deposit. When is the appropriate, like, how do you go about using that? Do you just call up your landlord and explain to them and say, hey, look, I was told this, can we use this? And, like, how's it go?
Okay, that's a really good question. Again, a lot of this new executive orders, they haven't been tested in any court because the court's just not even hearing it. But the deal is it's supposed to be applied towards your last month of rent. If this isn't your last month of rent, then the only way I can think of to interpret it is you can't necessarily use it, right? But I think with all things, it's a conversation with your landlord. A lot of landlords, understand. I mean, this isn't a secret that this is a very trying time for folks. And depending on what your type of job is, you may not have a job at this point in time, and there's no foreseeable time when you would be getting your job back. And so it is a challenge. And I've said earlier that, the purpose of your security deposit is for damages to your apartment later. And even in some of the executive orders, they said that, if you are going to even start a new lease and you've already applied some security, you can re-up that security upon the signing of a new lease. Okay. So I would say, reach out to your landlord and have a conversation with him or her, or maybe even, look at is this even the right apartment or house or whatever you're renting? Is this even the right place for you now? There may be another place that's better. I find that when folks have a lot of conflicts with people too, that it's just not healthy to be in a place where you're not happy or healthy in. I've had people and they really, really wanted to stay there, but they had a very awful relationship with their landlord or vice versa. And it just wasn't doing them any good. And then they moved on to find a place where they did have a better simpatico and life was just better. Sometimes if you're not getting along with people, and sometimes there's nothing you can do and there's no other place you can go to at that price or whatever, and you just have to suffer through your relationship with them and just kind of keep things on the minimal. Okay. But I always think it's better to just see what you can do to work things out with folks. And if you can't work things out with folks, just know that he or she can't really do a whole lot right now anyway. They can file for eviction, sure, but you're going to be at the back end of a list because people have been filing since last March and not been able to actually get on the court date. So I wouldn't, it's in landlords' best interest at this moment to work things out with their tenant to at least provide some income to the landlord, because as I said earlier, landlords don't usually have a lot of liquid assets, that's cash assets, and that's what tenants contribute to landlords. So it makes sense for a landlord who understands sense to hope to weather this storm, to work with good tenants who are willing to work with them. And that's the clinch. Because if a landlord has to chase a tenant down, has to call them 80,000 times, has to run around, bang on their door, whatever, that landlord is not going to be a happy camper to try and negotiate with. But if you reach out and you're proactive, typically, and I'm not saying this is for everybody, there are hard people and there are impossible people everywhere, but typically a landlord would be more able to work with you if they don't have to, chase after you, and you're willing to be upfront and you're willing to pay something. Whenever I've always had somebody who's willing to pay something, we're able to do all kinds of things, even if it's $10 or whatever, I don't know. But I mean, I just feel like a good faith effort for some folks is enough, but it's going to be hard. But you don't have to worry about being out on the street tomorrow, because there's no way of accomplishing that. So
I had a question. You were talking about financial assistance. Now, if you're out of a job due to COVID, is there financial assistance you can get, and how does it work?
So that I don't know. You can, well, I mean, let's see. So I think there is some rental relief, but I think that you have to apply for it online. If you go to, I can put this in the chat. There's let's see if I can copy this. On the official New Jersey COVID site, there is some information there, and I'm copying and pasting this into the link, into the chat, so that everybody can see that. But that would be the link. It's for it. Answers the question on the FAQs. What if I can't pay my rent? Can I still get evicted? And is there any rental relief? You can find, as they update things on there, what resources are available through the state of New Jersey to do that. So make sure you check that out. And there are limits of, what your percentage of income can be. But if your income is zero, that's easy enough to show, I would imagine, and to maybe get you some relief. But I can't say how much relief is available, and what they're going through, or what it's like. For example, a lot of these government entities at this time are very backed up. Some folks have been furloughed and on and off. So sometimes it takes a while to get responses or to move through the process. So I don't know if this is one of the processes that has been slowed down, or how much money they've allotted, but you can feel free to check out and follow that link for more information about how you can get some help.
I am aware too, Karen, it's different in every county, that there are organizations that have been designated as emergency rental assistance programs. They receive funding from the state to do that outreach and education, and other funding comes from non-state entities. I don't have the direct link to those. I do know that Catholic Charities is one of those organizations in Morris County, and these, and I don't know their requirements, but each county has a number of organizations, at least one, designated for emergency rental assistance.
Great.
I believe if you call 211, I think that's the emergency information line. You can get information. You just have to be a little bit more specific on what you need.
And here, I'll put in the chat as well. I just found something online for the links to the Morris County assistance. So I'll put that in there right now. So you can reach out and go through their website and see what options they have in the Office of Temporary Assistance as well, for finding rental assistance.
There's also assistance in paying utility bills.
Yes, and there's an office in Dover for that. I always get the acronym wrong. It is, let's see.
Heat.
It's, oh, that's gonna make me crazy.
Okay, I think we're gonna send out whatever parts of the replay you think are the most useful and links to people. Is that right, Irene?
I'm unmuting. I'm sorry. Yes, we'll put something together and send everyone links for assistance. We have been, putting different resources available. This presentation isn't the only part of this project. Andy is always pushing a little bit, pushing a little bit more. So we'll send some things out.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I can tell you, you know what, I can visualize where their office is. I just can't tell you. I think it's
I can't think of it either. It's on the tip of my tongue.
the part
It's
of the Hispanic affairs, I think, as well, and it just also covers utility payments, and they can also help with winterizing your home as well. And a lot of people don't realize it's
Isn't it LaHeap? Is
What?
it LaHeap? Is it?
no, it starts with an M.
there's lots of different organizations. There's even third-party nonprofits that will help. So there's like a cascade. So I feel like if anyone has any suggestions to go out in the email to people, they can put it in chat, and we'll also try to corral them together. We'll do some work and double check to make sure we really exhaust it, because I know people who have gotten help from nonprofits.
There we
There's
go.
a whole list of resources available on the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs. On the left-hand side of the screen are a number of links for energy assistance, for emergency rental assistance, and and then they link over to the counties. So that might be a good place for us to source some of the big ones.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea,
Here it is.
Shelley.
I found it. Okay, it's the Morris County Organization for Hispanic Affairs, and I put that in the link. And if you really scroll down, you can find out that they also do, again, winterizing and you help with utilities. So you can check that out. You do not have to necessarily be Hispanic to take advantage of their services. I don't know why they're grouped together, but they are definitely a part of each other. I've gone on a tour there. They're lovely, very, very helpful, kind people there. So feel free to check that out too.
Cara, I had one question also from someone who was not able to attend this evening, and they are going to watch whatever portion we're able to share. And the question was, even though there are no current court appearances for eviction proceedings, even though there are filings that have occurred, this gentleman asked, apparently he received information about coming to a settlement from a court employee. So it's,
What?
yeah, it was a request from a court, Morris County court employee to come to a settlement. So is it true that even though the eviction court case proceedings are not going forth, the process leading up to that is still happening?
Yes. So right now the court does send out letters to folks or via email if the landlord had been able to ascertain email or whatever about reaching a settlement. But if you do not have to reach a settlement, it's an option, because then, just like I was saying earlier, it's better if you all work something out amongst yourselves. And that's going to help the court later when they have this immense backlog of cases. To the extent that everybody can kind of get themselves back together again, it's great. Because when courts finally do pick this up, you have owed XYZ amount of rent, let's say, and let's say you haven't held it in escrow or whatever, that rent is due on the date of whatever it comes through as your court date. That might be after a year of not paying your rent. I can only imagine.
Yeah, I don't know this gentleman's circumstance, but apparently he just received information over the weekend. I don't know if it came in the form of a letter or an email from an employee at the Morris County court office.
Using either Zoom or Microsoft Teams, depending on the court and whatever. And the process is, and this would be the process at the courthouse as well on the day of your case in Morris and Sussex County, is that you get to sit down with a mediator. The mediator is typically either a specifically trained volunteer or a law clerk. I myself have mediated a lot of these cases. Even after clerking, I would just be finished with my case, and they'd say, well, who wants to help out mediating other cases? And sometimes I'd pick up another case. But whatever people can work out amongst themselves definitely helps things out. And sometimes it's just a matter of clearing the air between some people and some disagreements that they've had. And sometimes the landlord really doesn't want to let the tenant go, but tenant has been ashamed for a variety of reasons. They don't, because they can't pay and it's embarrassing to people, and they don't like the stigma of not being able to pay or provide for their family, so they don't answer. Or maybe the landlord hasn't been communicating, or they've had late fees and other things, and whatever the case is. And sometimes, well, a lot of times, people are able to actually work things out, and it can really lift a lot of the agita, the burden, the emotional stress of knowing that you're behind, or that X, Y, and Z is going to happen, or the stress of having to go to court. It looks really great in television, or and on shows, and Judge Judy, and it all looks super great, and it all looks great until you're there. And it all looks great until your entire day is at the courthouse. And it all looks really great until you're trying to describe to the judge, who cannot entertain your failure to pay rent, and you're sitting there with maybe 80 other people waiting for this thing to happen. Sometimes it's better right now, from the comfort of your own home, to work something out. And if you can't, that's fine. You don't have to agree to something. I went to one of these fairly recently. I was representing the tenant. We were in this with a landlord. We couldn't work anything out. They wouldn't negotiate with us. We had some options for things we were thinking about. We do have the money in escrow. We're ready to go when they are, but I mean, it takes two to tango, and they didn't want to tango, so they're just going to have to wait until whenever. And the court has made it very clear that this case is on for whenever. And it was filed in like March of last year, so we're somewhere in the queue. But if you're filing now, you're not ahead of me. So, and I'm still waiting. Okay, so
I have a question.
sure.
You talked about how you didn't write the laws, so sometimes they don't have results that you don't like. But let's say somewhere down the road, for some reason, you were in a position to make changes to some laws. Do you have any favorite pet peeves that you'd really like to see change? What should we advocate for?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would have loved to have more time to think about this, because I've spent a lot of time looking at the law, mostly from a landlord perspective, and that's why I feel like I'm good at arguing the tenant side, because I know what the landlord's going to say, because I've done it. I can tell you that it's probably going to work out X, Y, and Z, and I've mediated enough these cases to know. Sometimes it's just, I think that the process is not fair. I think that the waiting all day for your case to be called and whatever, and having 80 people, or if you're in Newark, and I've done cases in Newark, you're one of 100 plus people in this courtroom, whatever. It's not very respectful of people's time that they have to take off from work, or whatever the thing is. The reason they're there is because they couldn't pay. Most cases are there because they can't pay. Now they can't pay, and they're also missing a day of work. I found that COVID is horrible. My family had gotten it. It's bad. I have neighbors, friends, whatever. But what it's done is it's pushed some of our court system into the 1900s. I don't say the year 2000. We're not here. But now we can do things with Zoom, and they happen, or Microsoft Teams, and they happen more or less on time. And you can do it from your own home. And you don't have to pay an attorney to sit there with you all day. And you pay for me to sit there in a lot of cases. You will pay for me to sit there. And it's just as much fun for me to sit there as it is for you. Like, I don't get a big thrill about sitting there. My thrill is I like to argue, and I like to be an advocate for my client. It irks me that you have to kind of pay for me to sit there. So that's been better for people, in that it's allowed the courthouse in some matters to move in a way that's more efficient, and more, certainly in terms of time and convenience for folks or people with children. The Morris County Courthouse, and to get up on my little miniature soapbox here, is not very handicapped accessible. Or if you have kids in a stroller, I know that they're working on doing a rebuild and whatever. I can tell you firsthand from folks who have had to struggle or had their court cases have to move because of inaccessibility issues. And it's just like a wreck. it's just like a wreck. That people could go into a quiet area of their workspace or even their car and handle a proceeding from there, I think is a real game changer. That we can file things more online is a real game changer for folks. And I look for, even in the municipal, local level, that you're able to plea and do other things via online. I think that's great. It's unfortunate for folks who, for a variety of reasons, don't have access to the internet and other things to make this available. But for the bulk of people, you can use your phone even, and most phones do have this connectivity, you know, that you can do it or borrow from a friend or something. So I think that that's been a positive thing, and the more courts can do that and break down barriers to being accessible, especially for time, because time is money for so many folks who can't miss a day of work, can't do blah, 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 that it makes things better, easier and faster. So that's what I'd like to see. But I think currently in New Jersey, the law is very pro-tenant. And it has a lot of protections. It's just a matter of making sure that you use those protections and avail yourself of those protections. And know that you don't just have to get stuck in a bad lease. When the time comes up to negotiate your lease or look at your lease for the first time, a lot of folks don't like to read their documents. They find it overwhelming and challenging. It's in legalese. It's not user-friendly, but it's really important to find somebody to read it with you so you can understand that there are some things in there that maybe you didn't know about, and you can negotiate if it's not like the hottest property on the sun, right? And like everybody is whatever. Maybe there's something in there that you can work out. And that's something that I wish more tenants would try to do in advance rather than later. Be like, oh my God, I got that third cat. You know, read about it, understand what you can be charged for, and work on it with people and maintain a good relationship with your landlord. It is just like any other friendship you would have, you know. It's a mutual thing. If you're financially successful, your landlord is financially successful, people are happy, right? And because I think a smart landlord wants you to be happy, wants you to be able to pay your rent, wants you to be able to stay there as long as possible, because landlords lose money on the transition between tenants. It'll be empty for like a month, or they'd have to do repairs or do whatever. It's more financially beneficial for a landlord to have a tenant as long as possible who maintains a place in good shape and is, you know, liked by other tenants nearby, not creating an issue. And then it's great. They don't have to think about it. But if so, that's my wish list, my short wish list, without really having to think.
Sounds like a nice win-win description.
In a perfect world. So I think Shelley answered and put some questions in the chat. Do I think that there's value in creating tenants associations in corporate rental communities? I don't know. I've never really thought about it. I guess it depends on how many units there are and what bargaining power they think they could have. I mean, I guess it would be like a union in some way, you know, but I don't know. Sometimes when you have a big corporation and you have management companies and other things, I don't know what the management company may be communicating to the landlord. Maybe the landlord isn't one person. Maybe it's a group of people. Maybe it's a large group of investors. Maybe it's a shared something or other, where people don't really have very much day-to-day activity. It's so then it's up to the discretion of the property manager for a lot of things. So it's hard to reach the person who can make a lot of the decisions on this.
I don't know if I agree with that. I know that if this is owned by a corporation, owned by a family, and one person who's no longer here would push back because they were doing things that were kind of illegal, and she pushed back, and they just raised her rent really high.
Well, if they're doing illegal things, first of all, you always have the opportunity to report this to the police. And two, if they're raising the rent in a way, again, that we said earlier, like shocks the conscience and is for the purpose of harassment, not necessarily, again, tied to legitimate, I don't know, costs, expenses, and whatnot that the landlord is encompassing, then that could be a suit. You know, you have to, or you wouldn't sign the new lease or something. You know, those are the avenues that you can do, but it takes somebody to do it. A lot of folks complain about things, but they don't actually follow through. Even if, and I guess this is getting back to like a rental community, is understanding what your neighbors are paying in rent, because that's a factor, right? And understanding, you know, maybe collective bargaining to figure out how you can better afford the rent. But understand that the landlord, you know, they could fill your spot with someone else if you were to vacate, you know, so that's an issue too. I mean, you can always leave if you don't like it to find another place, but it's really not the goal. I wish they were treating you more fairly. Apparently, I was otherwise unaware of how bad the housing situation appears to be from your perspective out here in Mount Olive. I'm sorry that you're experiencing this because, you know, people should be treated fairly if possible.
I'm in Mount Arlington, so I think it's the same company. There's something in Mount Olive and Mount Arlington.
No, I'm sorry you're going through that.
So maybe we have two more in the chat box, Karen, and then we'll wrap it up for the evening.
How would we go about getting rent control in Mount Olive? That is a question that I don't know. I have dealt with rent control in Morris County, in Morristown, but the buildings were already put into it. The only way you can, so that's an annual filing that I have to do in Morristown, and that is the rent can only go up to the rent control amount unless there there's capital improvements and other things that can get shifted, you know, into the factors later, but you have to make certain applications and do other things to do that. But typically it is the rent control amount. I don't know what it would take to rent control a property though, to how it wound up that way. I jumped on board on managing that property after rent control was already in there. And then Morristown, I think, had changed the rules so that once somebody moved out of this unit, that it would become decontrolled, because I guess they were decontrolling the unit, but then once they moved in, then it would be recontrolled. So for example, the tenant had been at $1,200. They decided to leave of their own free, whatever. They moved on to greener pastures. They went someplace else. Next, I could list it for another price, whatever that was, whatever the market would sustain. But once in there, then the increases would be controlled by rent control. So that was finally an interesting nuance that would help, because rent in Morristown certainly can go quite high, but as does taxes and everything else in Morristown too. So you have to, you know, everything is a factor. But that was an interesting, you know, way they handled it. But I had filled out the forms for years, and sometimes I would actually fill them out in advance by calculating the rent increase based on like local averages and everything. And I'd have my paperwork in super early because that's the kind of person I am. That's my experience with rent control. But I think you can talk to folks in your housing authority to do that. And in Morristown, they have rent leveling as literally an office. And we would speak to folks in that office to get the projects done. So.
We have a last one here, Karen.
Sure. Is a corporation allowed to take you to collections now that the courts are not processing cases? Well, that's interesting. So they're not processing eviction, but you still owe money. But without a judgment, it's hard to collect. Now, they're not taking, so I remember I told you earlier that there are two different areas of the court, right? There's landlord tenant that answers the question, stay or leave, and there's a special civil division. special civil division is still going through. So let's say I don't pay my rent, I can still be sued for the amount of rent, and if that reduces to judgment, then they can still collect, right? Now that docket is not moving through super speedy at the moment, because courts are trying to get on board with all these changes and other things. And if you look up, you can find out all the omnibus orders that the Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey has put out directing for the way the day-to-day activities are being handled and what things are going through and when they started and stopped or whatever and what that looked like. But hypothetically, if special civil is going through, as they've been doing in other jurisdictions, then yes, you could still be sued for rent that's not paid, but you wouldn't be able to be removed. That's a separate process, and it's so critical to understand the difference between the two. So yes, you could still be sued for the amount of money you owe. And you could still be collected on it. And if you have an old judgment, they can still be collecting on that old judgment. Collections officers, and I'm in touch with one of them, and we're still levying on some accounts as part of a collection effort. So that's not in park.
In this case, I was just kind of asking, like, you get a letter from, the way that you get letters from like a credit card, then they say you owe this much money, and this is a law court, whatever, law office of so and so, and we, whatever that. So that's the one I was kind of asking. Can they still send those kind of collection letters?
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, look, as long as you owe money, they can still try and collect on it. But usually places have to go through with the whole getting a judgment against you before a judgment creditor can attack that. But certainly they can start to try and ask for money. Now they have to follow certain guidelines for being able to track you down for money, by the way. They can't harass you to do it. Although you may feel that one notice is already harassment because it's annoying and you don't want to hear it from them, but that's not quite it. So there are certain guidelines. And when I represent folks who have creditors who are hot on their heels, I definitely start out with trying to diffuse the matter and work through, again, it's like I was saying with landlord in negotiations, and trying to put everybody back on track, or letting people know that this is never going to be on track because we dispute the amount in process or whatever, or something, figuring out where people at what proofs that they have that you owe money, or you can acknowledge it. I mean, yes, you haven't paid 3 months or whatever the case is, but you have to be careful because they shouldn't, there are some regulations with regards to whether or not they can report that to creditors, your credit, like Equifax, TransUnion and the likes, whether that can start to damage your credit. And where are they in the process? Did they obtain a judgment against you? Sometimes folks don't realize that they have. They've been served or whatever, or they decided to throw out that piece of mail. It was easier to ignore. Or sometimes court notices, especially in Morris and Sussex County, they get sent to you on these very thin, like postcards. They're very thin, like cardboardy type stock, but they get caught in mailboxes or between other things, or maybe you missed it, and who knows. So it's important to find out what they have, how they got to this process, and then to see what, if anything, you want to do. Sometimes creditors are willing to accept a percentage of whatever it is that was owed. Sometimes they're not. So you have to really reach out to folks and find out where it's at. And, it's scary for people to be in this situation because you feel vulnerable because it's an attorney. But typically these collection agencies, you don't actually talk to the attorney who's on the letterhead. Very frequently it's somebody else in the office who is just, going through the checklist of things that they need to have. I've had many instances with creditors, and even as an attorney, I don't often deal with the attorney at the wheel of it. Sometimes I do, but Frequently it can be somebody else. And I'll give you a little story. I represented somebody who was being sued, but it wasn't actually a real person. They had misrepresented the name of this individual, and it was covered by insurance, but because they processed their name incorrectly and their insurance information incorrectly, well, then the bill wasn't processed. The bill went to a collection agency because it was unpaid. And my response is, well, it's not a legal person that you're trying to recover money from, but if you put in this real name and this real number, you'll be able to collect the money. And they kept on sending us letters and whatever. And I was like, well, you know, whatever. And then eventually it's percolated into multiple phone calls from me saying that this isn't a real, and this is the kind of thing is that sometimes, you know, and we worked it out eventually, but sometimes it can be an annoying, strenuous process, but still in all, there are creditors. I've had a lovely experience with somebody out of Morristown where they were willing to work with us, and I was able to resolve the issue and we get it done. And then some people are impossible, like the name issue people who are just like completely impossible and completely wrong. And then that went on forever. So people.
Did that answer your question, Madreen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Cara, thank you so much. Thank you just for your time, your expertise, your practical experience, your straight talk, and most importantly, letting us know that those of us in this situation are not alone, and that there are resources. And before we close, I just want to acknowledge also Dr. Antoine Gales. Thank you so much. Antoine Gales is a member of our Board of Education here in Mount Olive. For those of you who are in Mount Olive, you're welcome to join us at upcoming events. You'll note on our website, Mount Olive Democrats, we have a special event tomorrow night. It's an inauguration ball. If you'd like to join other fellow Democrats and celebrate the inauguration of our new president and vice president, please feel free to join us for that free event. On Monday, the 25th, we have a monthly open meeting. This month, we're featuring local talent, 2 young musicians who call themselves Glass Doors. Will be performing a small set. So everybody is welcome to join us for that. 2 young men from Mount Olive. On Tuesday the 6th, we have our monthly food drive. We do that in Turkey Brook the first Saturday of every month. So you're more than welcome, please, to stop by, say hello, and all donations go to local food pantries. We have a special event we're just announcing tomorrow on the vaccines. We have a local expert, Dr. Sean O'Connell, who will be presenting on Wednesday, February 10th. Everything you want to know about vaccines. He is a local expert on immunology, and we're proud to have him, again, an open event similar to this, open to the community. And then on the 20th of February, we'll be having a monthly environmental cleanup event. We just did Link Road. Thank you for those of us on the call here who were part of that. So please check our website, check our newsletter, a lot of upcoming events, and we welcome everybody's participation. Thank you for everybody who made time to come tonight, Cara, especially again to you for your generosity and your expertise. And with that being said, I wish everybody safety, health, and hopefully that 2021 is a recovery year. And so,
Yes.
Thank you so much. It was a real honor and a pleasure to be here. If you have any additional questions that are general questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you have, you know, a need for consultation, I'm also available for that. And I'm happy, you know, I became an attorney because I wanted to help people. So please, you know, don't feel bad for not knowing anything. There are no stupid questions ever. You're not expected to know everything. And so I'm always here to help you if you need something.
This was great. Thank you so much for your time. I'm masked up. I'm in the store. So I carried it from my house to the store because it was so interesting. So I want to thank you for the time and the committee for putting this together. I'll be on, and thank you. This was very informative.
hope to see you all again. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Good
very
night.
much, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.